Hello everybody, this is Ahmed mostly, and I'm about to do my second batch of Zelda Timeline lecture videos. The reason why I'm doing this now is threefold. First off, I want to just apologize for my previous batch of videos, even though they were pretty good in information. Everybody complained about the quality and about the white balance. There's a lot of red. So here am I right now, armed with some new equipment, an iPhone and an iPad. So this is going to be a really interesting experiment. Hopefully we could get through this. The second reason is tomorrow, supposedly, the Zelda Timeline is going to be revealed by Nintendo. They're releasing some art book in Japan in honor of the 25th anniversary of the Zelda series. And a lot of people are saying that the timeline is finally going to be revealed there. So I want to get this out as soon as possible, and hopefully what I'm about to say will match what Nintendo wants to say about it. The third thing, I just want to I want to mostly focus on the location of the Four Swords series in the timeline. They're really ambiguous, so I need to talk about those more, but at the same time, I'm not going to talk about those exclusively because, as you all know, if you're going to talk about a batch of games, you have to talk about everything. So, in order to attach the Four Swords series to a specific part of the timeline, I have to talk about the whole games, or all of the games, hopefully not extensively, so I don't keep rambling on here and there. So let's start off. First off, I'm gonna list out what I said or what I wrote in the previous video. They call it the fail-safe timeline, but what was suggested in the fail-safe timeline, what I mean is fail-safe as in the confirmed timeline from the developers, everything we know so far. There's no argument what I'm going to write here whatsoever. You can't argue about that because that's what the developers say, and they actually, show it in their games and relate to it with the, extensive developer commentary. So let's list off here. I'm going to dumb it down, and instead of writing the initials, I'm going to write the first name of each game so you guys can yeah. Oh my god. So, this is I'd like to call this like the first era per se. And as you see here, this is Ocarina of Time. We know now Skyward Sword takes place before that. And the split timeline is confirmed. So, Ocarina's adult to the Wind Waker, and Ocarina the Child timeline to Majora's Mask, and Majora's Mask is followed by Twilight Princess. That's basically confirmed, and that's the most complicated era of the timeline per se. So this is like the second era and third era combined. A Link to the Past, followed by Link's Awakening, and these feature the same Link. And then a couple of centuries later, supposedly followed by The Legend of Zelda, the original for the Nintendo, and Zelda 2, which features Ganon's death and whatnot. So, yeah, this, as we've said before, there's no official attachment to this in regards to this era, the first era of the timeline. there was previously a link between A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, but now that the Wind Waker and Majora's Mask and the whole split timeline debacle, this link has been sort of shattered, or became more ambiguous. So we're not sure where A Link to the Past or this era takes place. Does it take place in the adult timeline or take place in the child timeline? So this is one of the big areas of debate when we're talking about the timeline. Hopefully this gets revealed tomorrow. So let's start off with the third era, which is, well, not the third era, the third batch of the games per se. This is the they call this the Four Swords series. So it's the Minish Cap first, followed by the Four Swords, and the Four Swords Advance for the GameCube. I'm going to talk about this more later. So the main thing is, it has to go in this order. A lot of people, there's two schools of thought. They like batching these games together in this order, or they go through these order but separate the games, like attach Minish, put it before Ocarina of Time, and then the Four Swords goes somewhere else, and the Four Swords Advance goes with A Link to the Past. So there are two schools of thought I'm going to talk about more later. And then finally we got the final batch of games, which is the Oracle series, another ambiguous game. So yeah, basically that's the fail-safe. Again, the Oracle series, we don't know. There's no official source of where these games take place in the timeline, just like the Four Swords series. So yeah, that's basically the fail-safe. We're gonna, talk about how these games relate to each other, specifically the Four Swords series. So before I get to that, I'd like to, touch on the types of interpretation people like to go through. What I like to do, and what should be done, in my opinion, is look at the big picture. Look at the main common elements that we see in the Zelda series, and try to batch the games together depending on these common elements. So I'm going to list them out, the common elements in the Zelda series. First off, the Triforce. Second, the Master Sword. Third, Ganon. Fourth, other main characters like Link and Zelda. Finally, important timeline related events. Or not finally, I got another point to say here. And here, finally, the developer commentary. So each element is, they do help each other, and they're important on their own. The reason, the Triforce and the Master Sword have been in many Zelda games, and they're like the chain between these games. Depending, the Triforce's status basically tells you where specific games takes place. And regarding Ganondorf, he's been the only enemy which has lived through generations and eras, and there are a few games like the Four Sword that do mention reincarnation, which basically means that he's not the same Ganondorf that it was before, but at the same time he's been the most common enemy seen in the Zelda series, or the most important enemy seen there, or the important antagonist. And regarding, I say main characters like Link and Zelda, for example, because a lot of people get confused about, specific eras of games. For example, it's a known fact that the Link of Link to the Past, for example, is the same one from Link's Awakening. They're not in separate eras, or they don't take place 100 years in between. Same thing when you're talking about the Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass for the DS. The Link here is the same Link, and some of the characters like Tetra and the pirate crew, they're the same batch of people. And Spirit Tracks as you're going to see as well. Uh, Here, the game shows that it takes place, a couple of years, 50 to 100 years after Phantom Hourglass, because it does feature a different Link, but at the same time, you'll see that one of the crew members from the Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass is there, and he's old, and he does reminisce with you about his adventures with a previous Link, or his ancestor per se, or whatever. So yeah, that's why I want to say Link and Zelda. And important timeline events. Each game has a really important event that relates to the overall big picture that I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about that more later. And finally, the developer commentary. This is an on and off thing. In my opinion, the developer commentary of recent games, or the recent commentaries, are the most updated ones. But there are a lot of erroneous ones throughout the years, like when Miyamoto said that A Link to the Past is first and stuff like that. Mistranslation errors, or maybe Miyamoto didn't know much about the timeline back then. And stuff like, a lot of people think that the chain, of course I talked about the relation between The Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. That's gotten weaker throughout the years when new Zelda games get released, so that we could take into consideration, but not take it, too seriously. And stuff like when you're talking about the relationship between A Link to the Past and A Legend of Zelda and the adventure of, the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo game, the original Nintendo games. The relationship between them, of course, they've never been touched upon, in over maybe 15 years since their release. But at the same time, these are the only things that the only thing that we can rely upon is developer commentary. The games no longer show, because they're aged and old, they no longer show a big relationship between the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo era games. So again, yeah, some people like to cut that relationship or cut that bond. Some people like to keep it, in honor of the developers. So yeah, that's it regarding the developer commentary. And like I said, these are the main elements. I'm going to touch upon, with each era or each batch of games, I'm going to touch upon these elements. And then, the main goal is to try and link these batches of games which depend on the results of the analysis we're going to talk about here. Before that, I'm going to talk about, there are bad examples that I don't like to, use or rely on when talking about the timeline or the big picture. A lot of people like saying, okay, example, there are a lot of side characters like Tingle or and whatnot that are featured in Zelda games or as cameo appearances. For example, the Minish Cap has a lot of characters from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Same thing when you talk about the Oracle series. You'll see like a Goron, you'll see like, not a Goron, you'll see, certain characters you remember, Tingle, whatever. People like to say, okay, because these characters are in both games, that means we have to relate both games together. I don't think that's a good idea. People like Impa, for example. Impa has, again, she's been a constant character in the Zelda series. Just because she's in the Oracle series, for example, doesn't mean that the Oracle series we have to relate it to the Impa of Ocarina of Time. They both look different, and at the same time they're that's what I like to think. People like, maybe for example, they think that just because the Minish Cap features is the first game that features a hatless Link, and it talks about the story of how Link gets his hat, that doesn't mean that the Minish Cap necessarily takes place the first in the timeline. I don't see it that way, in my opinion. We should look at the bigger picture or more important events. Even like people like to say, okay, because Epona or the horse is in the Oracle series, that means the Oracle series take place after Majora's Mask. But that really doesn't make any sense, because in Majora's Mask the Triforce is nowhere in Hyrule, and in the Oracle series they are in Hyrule. So yeah, I'm gonna touch upon these aspects once more once we talk about more, the more and more we get into this lecture series. So, as I said, because I'd like to talk about the Four Swords more, we're gonna feature them first. So let's talk bit by bit. The Triforce, Four Swords series. As you know, these games, I'll say them again. Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Four Swords Advance. Basically, let's first off, the Triforce in these games, the location. One of the major aspects about the Four Sword games is they do not feature the Triforce at all. All you see is like banners in the castle, the shield. You see the icon of the Triforce, but nobody talks about the Triforce in these games whatsoever. Instead, the Minish Cap and Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures like to talk about the Life Force. This is sort of like a replacement of the Triforce in these games. We don't know the relationship between these two. A lot of people like to, talk about theories and what are the relationship between the Triforce and the Life Force. And I think the developers previously, years back, hinted that there is a relationship, but it's ambiguous. We're not going to talk about it. So, the Life Force or the Light Force, they actually call it in the Four Swords game. It's featured in the intro of the Minish Cap, where they talk about the Minish ridding evil of the land by sending off a sword from the sky and the golden light. They call it the golden light. And then in the end of the Minish Cap, they do actually feature the Light Force as a major aspect of the game. The main antagonist Vati is actually yearning or hungering for the Light Force, and actually saps it off Zelda, which turns Zelda to stone. That's featured in the intro of the game, and then at the end they actually talk about that more, expand about that more. This Vati just saps the force out of Zelda, and Zelda turns into stone. Since we talked about that aspect, we're going to jump into the timeline events. The first thing, as I mentioned right now, is this is going to be a really important element later, is Vati sapping the Light Force off Zelda and Zelda turning into stone. This is really important. I'll show you why later. The second thing is Ganondorf's revival in the Four Swords Adventures. None of the games in the Four Swords series talk about Ganondorf except for the last one, which actually talks about Ganondorf's revival and the reincarnation. It's not the same Ganondorf we know about from Ocarina of Time and the Wind Waker and Majora's whatever that era of games, but they do feature common elements like the trident and how the underlings want to revive him, and how Ganondorf was using Vati all along for his revival. But as I said, it's a reincarnation. They like the games usually throw this word in, the reincarnation. It's not the same Ganondorf, but it is an important event nonetheless, because that shows that these batches of games, they're not in their own universe per se, like an alternate legend. They are within the timeline, but it's very vague. It's very hard to attach it. That's regarding the important events, and the Master Sword in these games, it's nowhere to be found. Instead, it's replaced by something called the Four Sword. And developer commentary, like I said, they do not talk about these games at all. They only say they're the oldest in the timeline. That's a statement from years back, way back, and it is kind of outdated by now. We don't know what oldest means. Does it mean that it takes place in the first of the timeline, or it takes place at the end of the timeline? They're old, really old legends, so we're not really sure what they mean by oldest. So yeah, that's it regarding the Four Swords series. And as you can see, the Four Swords series, and I'll talk about this later more, is they're really unlike any other games in the timeline. They're sort of on their own per se. The only common element, or the big element you'll see, is the Light Force or the Life Force. That's the biggest relationship you'll see. But other than that, there's no Triforce, there's no Master Sword. So that's why I'd like to, it's really, I find it irritating that people like to disattach the Four Swords game from each other. And for example, they like to associate Four Swords Adventures with A Link to the Past. for this only reason is there are a lot of parallelisms, or a lot of common elements between these games. So people say, okay, since there's something called the Knights of Hyrule and the princesses are trapped in crystals, just like in the Link to the Past, and that means that the Four Sword Adventures is related to A Link to the Past. But I say no. Where's the Triforce? It doesn't make any sense that in between the first era of games, which is Ocarina, Majora, whatever, and A Link to the Past, what happens in between these years? There should be some common elements, but the Four Swords, if you put that in between, where you want to put it in the timeline, like if you're putting A Link to the Past in the child timeline, for example, after Twilight Princess, but you want to put Four Swords Adventures in the middle between Twilight Princess and A Link to the Past, it doesn't make any sense because there's basically no common elements, and it's just hard to imagine spanning like eras in between these games and sudden changes. Like, okay, suddenly the Master Sword is not there, it's replaced by the Four Sword, and then it goes back to the Master Sword, and then the Triforce appears again out of nowhere. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever for them to do that. And the same thing with the Minish Cap being the first in the timeline. I really don't see this happening. But speaking of which, a good thing I've been rambling on, because there is one other timeline spanning event that I haven't talked about. The Minish Cap does elude itself for being the first in the timeline in a couple of ways. The biggest ways, throughout the game, you'll see that the Minish like to praise themselves for actually placing stuff like rupees, or placing stuff like items hidden within jars and within certain, the typical Zelda element of going in houses and breaking jars and breaking grass and cutting grass outside, and you'll see rupees and items there. The Minish like to, say that they're the ones responsible for putting these items there, because they're so small and tiny, you can't see them working. So they're the ones who placed these items there. That is basically really important, and I'm gonna counter my argument later once I talk about the rest of the games and tell you how do I make this event make sense while Minish Cap doesn't place the first in the timeline. So let's recap the important timeline events in the Four Swords series. First off is the Minish are actually the ones responsible for placing items or rupees under jars and the grass. Second thing is the reincarnation of Ganondorf in Four Swords Adventures. And the third thing is Vati sapping the light force off Zelda and Zelda turning into stone. Great.